For most of American history, land meant freedom. The frontier promised something simple, that anyone could go west, claim a piece of the earth, and start over. No title required, no ancestry, no connection to the right family or the right name, just will and labor, and the willingness to show up somewhere new and plant your flag in the ground. It was a promise that shaped everything about how Americans understand themselves. The open land, the self-made man, the idea that this country, unlike the old countries across the ocean, would never become a place where the soil beneath your feet belonged to someone you would never meet, someone whose great-great-grandfather had claimed it before you were born. That promise is one of the deepest stories Americans tell about themselves. But today, that story hides a strange reality. Across the United States, vast stretches of forests, ranches, mountains, and rivers belong to a surprisingly small group of people. Some of them are famous. Most of them are not. Their names do not appear on the land the way names appear on buildings. You can drive through their territory for hours without seeing a single sign that tells you whose ground you are crossing. One of them quietly accumulated more than 2 million acres, an area larger than the state of Delaware and Rhode Island combined, an area larger than some entire nations. His name is John Malone, a billionaire known, to those who know him at all, as the cable cowboy, a man who helped build the modern media industry and then spent decades doing something that almost no one was paying attention to. He was buying the American landscape. But Malone's story is really the entry point into something much larger, because he is not alone. Across the country, a new class of extraordinarily wealthy individuals has been doing the same thing, quietly, persistently, at a scale that most people never see, because the land itself absorbs the evidence. This is a story about power expressed through land. It is a story about what happens when the landscapes that define a country quietly end up in the hands of a few people, about what that means for the water, the wildlife, the rural communities, the political geography of a nation that still tells itself the story of the open frontier. It is not a simple story. The people at its center are not simple villains. The land they own is, in many cases, genuinely beautiful and genuinely protected. The intentions involved are, at least sometimes, genuinely conservationist. But intentions and consequences are not always the same thing. And the question this story is really asking is not whether any individual land baron is good or bad. It is a deeper question, an older question. One that this country has been circling for its entire existence without ever fully answering. Who should control the land that defines a nation? The frontier promised that the answer was everyone. The map suggests something different. Chapter 1. The map nobody talks about. There is a map that most Americans have never seen. It does not hang in government buildings. It is not taught in schools. You will not find it on the front page of any newspaper, but it exists. And what it shows changes everything about how you understand the country you live in. It is a map of who owns America. Not America in the abstract, not the idea of America, the actual soil, the forests, the ranches, the mountain ranges, the river valleys, the high desert plains that stretch so far, you lose track of where they end. The United States contains roughly 2.26 billion acres of land. That is a number so large it becomes almost meaningless. So consider it another way. If you drove across this country from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the rocky coast of Maine to the tide pools of California, you would cross land that belongs to someone. In many cases, that someone is not who you might expect. Roughly 60% of American land is privately owned. The rest belongs to federal and state governments, tribal nations, and other public entities. But within that vast private territory, something striking has happened over the past several decades. Land has been moving, quietly, steadily, and it has been moving in one direction, toward fewer and fewer hands. Today, in the 21st century, the 100 largest private landowners in the United States control more than 40 million acres combined. To understand that scale, consider this. 40 million acres is larger than the entire state of Georgia. It is larger than New England. It is a territory the size of a small nation held by 100 people. And that number is growing. Of those 40 million acres, the 20 largest landowners alone account for more than half the total. The single largest private landowner holds more than 2 million acres, an area larger than the combined size of Delaware and Rhode Island. In the state of Maine, one owner controls more than 5% of all the land in the state. In Wyoming, a handful of individual landowners together control more than 1 million acres between them. The entire state of Connecticut, the state where the man at the center of this story was born, covers just under 3 million acres. That one man owns a territory nearly as large as the state he grew up in. This is not a story about ranchers who worked hard for generations to build something worth keeping. Those people exist, and their story is real and worth honoring. This is a different kind of story. It is about something newer, something quieter, something that happened not over generations, but over decades, and sometimes within a single lifetime. It is about the rise of the modern American land baron. In the 19th century, the word baron was not a compliment. The robber barons of the Gilded Age, the railroad kings and oil magnates and steel emperors, accumulated wealth and power on a scale that shocked even the most hardened observers of that era. They were not celebrated, they were feared. And eventually, through antitrust law and public pressure and the sheer moral weight of inequality, some of their power was broken up and redistributed. But land is different from oil. It is different from railroad shares or steel mills or cable contracts. Land does not break down. Land does not become obsolete. Land cannot be regulated out of existence. Land simply sits there, holding its value, year after year, generation after generation, long after the person who bought it is gone. And that is what makes the map so strange to look at. Because when you trace the outlines of the largest private land holdings in America, you do not see a picture of democratic ownership. You do not see a nation of small farmers and family ranchers and independent homesteaders living out the old frontier promise. You see something else entirely. You see concentration. You see a pattern that looks, if you squint at it long enough, not entirely unlike the aristocratic land systems that the original American settlers were trying to escape. How did this happen? That is the question this story is trying to answer. And the answer, it turns out, begins not in the great open West, but in a cable television office in Denver, Colorado, in the 1970s. It begins with a man who understood something profound about systems, about debt, about tax law, about the way power accumulates when you know how to structure it correctly. It begins with a man named John Malone. But before we get to him, we need to understand the land itself, because the land came first. It always does. Chapter 2. The Man Behind 2 Million Acres. Most billionaires at some point want you to know they are billionaires. They build towers with their names on them. They buy sports teams and sit courtside under television cameras. They launch rockets into space and hold press conferences about the future of humanity. They exist, in some fundamental way, in public, and the public, in turn, knows them, studies them, forms opinions about them. John Malone is not that kind of billionaire. He does not seek attention. He does not court the press. For long stretches of his career, he was one of the most powerful men in American media, and still, most people in that media had no idea who he was. He preferred it that way. He has always preferred it that way. Malone was born in 1941 in Milford, Connecticut, the son of an engineer. He was, by every account, brilliant from the beginning. Not brilliant in the showy way of someone who needs to prove himself in public, but brilliant in the quiet, structural way of a man who sees how systems work and immediately begins thinking about how to improve them, or exploit them, or both. He studied electrical engineering at Yale. He went on to earn a master's degree in industrial management from Johns Hopkins, and then a doctorate in operations research from the same institution. Before he was 30 years old, he held 3 advanced degrees and had begun working at Bell Labs, one of the most prestigious research institutions in American history. Bell Labs in those years was a place where genuinely transformative thinking happened. The transistor was invented there. Information theory was developed there. The people who worked in those halls were not merely smart. They were operating at the edge of what was knowable. And John Malone fit in among them, not because he was the most theoretical thinker in the room, but because he could see, with unusual clarity, how theoretical insight translated into practical systems. He moved on. He always moved on. He spent time at McKinsey. He worked at a cable startup that was part of the General Instrument Corporation. And then, in 1973, at the age of 32, he became the chief executive of a struggling cable company called Telecommunications, Inc., known as TCI. At the time, cable television was not yet the dominant industry it would become. Most Americans still watched broadcast television. The idea that you would pay a monthly fee to receive television signals through a wire running into your home was, to many people, still a novelty. But Malone saw something others did not. He saw that cable was not just an entertainment delivery system. It was an infrastructure play. It was a network, and networks, once built, tend to be extraordinarily difficult to displace. Networks generate recurring revenue. Networks can be leveraged. Networks can be expanded through debt, through acquisition, through the patient accumulation of geography. John Malone understood networks, and over the next 2.5 decades, he would build one of the most formidable private media networks in American history. But here is what makes Malone a different kind of figure than the usual billionaire story. Most people who build enormous companies become identified with those companies. Their name and their enterprise fuse together in the public imagination. You cannot say Standard Oil without thinking of John D. Rockefeller. You cannot say Apple without thinking of Steve Jobs. The company and the man become inseparable. Malone is not like that. TCI made him wealthy. Liberty Media, the complex financial structure he built after TCI, made him one of the most powerful figures in global media. But Malone himself remained stubbornly, privately, almost mysteriously, separate from all of it. When most people imagine a man who owns 2.2 million acres of American land, they imagine someone whose face they recognize, someone they have seen on a magazine cover or heard interviewed on the radio, someone who feels, in some sense, like a public figure. John Malone does not look like that. He is, in the language that gets used about him, a system thinker. He is a man who sees structures where others see stories. He is a man who looked at cable television and saw leverage, who looked at land and saw something else entirely. What did he see? That is the question worth sitting with, because 2 million acres is not a hobby. It is not a vacation home or a weekend ranch or an investment in a single piece of beautiful property. 2 million acres is a project. It is a commitment. It is, in some meaningful sense, a philosophy made physical. To understand that philosophy, you first have to understand where Malone came from. Not the Connecticut of his childhood, but the intellectual landscape he was trained to navigate. The world of debt, equity, tax law, and leverage. The world of long-term thinking in an economy that rewards the short term. The world of systems. And in that world, land may be the oldest and most reliable system of all. Chapter 3: America's New Aristocracy. There is a word that Americans are deeply uncomfortable applying to themselves. Aristocracy. It is a European word, an old world word, a word for systems that the founders of this republic explicitly rejected when they declared that all men are created equal, that no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, that the idea of inherited power and inherited privilege was fundamentally incompatible with the democratic experiment they were attempting to build. And yet, land has always told a different story. In the earliest years of the American Republic, land was power. This was not metaphorical. It was constitutional. For much of the country's early history, only landowners could vote. Only landowners had full standing before the law. Only landowners were considered, in the most literal sense, citizens in the complete meaning of that word. The founders knew this, of course. Many of them were large landowners themselves. George Washington held tens of thousands of acres across Virginia and what is now West Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, despite his debts, owned more than 10,000 acres at his peak. These were not men who owned land as a hobby or an investment. They owned land because land was the foundation of the social order they were building. And the system they built, despite the democratic language surrounding it, replicated many of the structures they claimed to be escaping. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, vast tracts of American land were distributed through mechanisms that concentrated wealth rather than spreading it. Land grants, government contracts, and political connections gave enormous parcels to well-connected individuals and companies. The ordinary farmer, the immigrant family, the freedmen after the Civil War, these people were told the land was available to anyone willing to claim it, and sometimes that was true. But more often, the best land, the land near rivers and rail lines and ports, had already been claimed by the time the ordinary person arrived to make their own claim. This pattern accelerated in the second half of the 19th century with the rise of the railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad is one of the foundational stories of American capitalism. It connected a continent. It opened the West. It made possible the enormous economic expansion of the Gilded Age. These things are true, but the railroad companies did not build those lines out of patriotism. They built them because the federal government gave them, in the form of land grants, enormous strips of territory on either side of the tracks. Millions of acres. Some estimates suggest that the railroads received more than 170 million acres in total land grants from the federal government, an area roughly the size of Texas and California combined. They sold some of that land to settlers. They kept enormous amounts of it. They used it as collateral to borrow money. They leveraged it to build empires that went far beyond transportation. The timber barons came next. Men like Frederick Weyerhaeuser, who acquired more than 900,000 acres of Pacific Northwest timberland in a single transaction in 1900. The cattle barons of the Southwest, who ran their herds across ranges so vast they were effectively private kingdoms, enforced not by law, but by sheer physical presence and economic dominance. And then, in the 20th century, the land shifted again. The great estates broke up in some cases. Inheritance taxes took their toll on some dynasties. Public land movements pushed back against the concentration of private ownership. The New Deal era saw a genuine, if partial, redistribution of some economic power. But the underlying pattern never fully changed. Because land, unlike other forms of wealth, resists redistribution. You can tax an income, you can regulate a monopoly, you can break up a company. But land sits there, patient and immovable, and the person who holds the deed keeps holding it until they decide, or are forced, to let go. And today, in the 21st century, a new class of land barons has emerged. They do not look like the cattle kings of the 1880s. They do not look like the railroad tycoons of the Gilded Age. They wear different clothes and speak a different language, and their wealth came from different industries. But the pattern is remarkably familiar. Billionaires from the technology and media and finance industries, men who built their fortunes in the fast-moving abstract world of information and capital, are now converting those abstract fortunes into the oldest, most tangible form of wealth that exists. They are buying land. And they are buying it in quantities that would have raised eyebrows in any era. Ted Turner, the media mogul who founded CNN, became the largest private landowner in the United States in the 1990s, accumulating nearly 2 million acres across multiple states, much of it devoted to conservation and bison ranching. Stan Kroenke, the sports billionaire married into the Walmart family, owns enormous ranches across the Rocky Mountain West, including the historic Wagoner Ranch in Texas. The Emerson family, whose Sierra Pacific Industries controls millions of acres of California timberland, has quietly surpassed even Malone in total acreage in recent years. The transcontinental railroad companies received an estimated 170 million acres in federal land grants in the 19th century, more than 7% of the entire land area of the contiguous United States. Frederick Weyerhaeuser acquired 900,000 acres of Pacific Northwest timber in a single transaction in the year 1900. The Wagoner Ranch in Texas alone spans more than 500,000 acres, making it one of the largest contiguous ranches in the country. Ted Turner's holdings at their peak stretched across 6 different states. The Emerson family's Sierra Pacific Industries now controls over 2 million acres of California and Washington timberland, and the number of billionaires actively acquiring land in the American West has increased in every decade since 1980. These are not isolated cases. They are part of a pattern, a quiet, steady accumulation of American land by a small number of extraordinarily wealthy individuals. And the question that pattern raises is not simple. Is this preservation? Is this investment? Is this, in some form we have not yet named, the emergence of something that looks uncomfortably like an American landed aristocracy? The answer, if there is one, is still being written. But the history that led here is long, and it has a logic to it that is worth understanding before we can begin to judge it. Chapter 4. The Cable Cowboy. In the spring of 1973, a 32-year-old engineer from Connecticut drove into Denver, Colorado, to take over a company that was, by most measures, a mess. Telecommunications, Inc. had more than 300 cable franchises scattered across rural America. Its books were complicated. Its debt was significant. Its management was, at best, erratic. Most serious people in the cable industry regarded TCI as a collection of problems waiting to become a catastrophe. John Malone looked at it and saw something else entirely. He saw leverage. To understand what Malone built at TCI, you have to understand something about the economics of cable television in the 1970s and, more broadly, about the kind of mind that sees opportunity where others see confusion. Cable television in that era was a capital-intensive business. Building out the physical infrastructure, laying the wires, installing the equipment, negotiating the local franchise agreements with city and county governments, all of it required enormous upfront spending. And all of it generated recurring revenue once it was in place. People paid their cable bill every month. They paid it whether or not they were watching television. They paid it in good economies and bad ones. Malone understood that this kind of predictable, recurring cash flow was the foundation of a financial strategy that most people in the industry had not yet grasped. If your cash flow is reliable, you can borrow against it. And if you borrow against it, you can expand. And if you expand, your cash flow grows. And if your cash flow grows, you can borrow more. This is, in its bare structure, a simple idea. But Malone executed it with a precision and aggression that transformed it into something extraordinary. He acquired cable systems the way other people acquire books, constantly, methodically, always looking for the next addition to the library. And crucially, he used debt not as a burden to be minimized, but as a tool to be wielded. This made TCI look strange on paper. The company carried enormous amounts of debt. Its profits, by conventional accounting measures, were often minimal or negative. Critics questioned whether the whole enterprise was sustainable, and Malone would listen to those criticisms, and then, with the patient explanatory manner of a man who has already done the math and found it works out, explain that the critics were measuring the wrong things. They were looking at net income. He was looking at cash flow. They were worrying about debt. He was using debt as a mechanism to defer taxes because the interest payments reduced taxable income, and a dollar not paid in taxes today was a dollar available for tomorrow's acquisition. It was not illegal. It was not even unusual in principle. But the scale at which Malone applied it, and the consistency with which he applied it over more than 2 decades, was genuinely without precedent in American cable television. By the late 1980s, TCI was the largest cable company in the United States. It reached more than 12 million subscribers. It had interests in cable systems, content companies, and technology ventures that stretched across the country and eventually beyond it. And along the way, Malone had earned a reputation. He was called the Cable Cowboy. The nickname captured something real about him, not the romantic image of the frontier cowboy, the solitary figure on horseback beneath an open sky, but the older, harder meaning of the word. The businessman cowboy, the man who worked at the edge of the settled territory, who operated outside the conventions that governed the more established players, who was willing to be rough and tactical and occasionally ruthless in pursuit of what he was building. He had confrontations with content providers. He had confrontations with politicians. In 1993, the United States Senate held hearings on cable industry practices, and John Malone was summoned to testify. The senator from Delaware, Joseph Biden, questioned him about TCI's pricing practices and its treatment of competitors. It was not a comfortable exchange, but Malone was not building TCI to be comfortable. He was building it to be dominant. And then, in 1999, he sold it. AT&T acquired Telecommunications, Inc. for approximately $55 billion. It was one of the largest media transactions in American history at that point. Malone walked away from the deal with a personal fortune that, depending on how you valued the various pieces, ran into the billions of dollars. He was 57 years old. For most people, that would be the end of the story. The conclusion, the part where you sell the company, take the money, and begin the slow, comfortable process of spending it. But John Malone was not most people, because while he was building TCI, while he was acquiring cable franchises and negotiating with senators and explaining his financial philosophy to skeptical journalists, he was also doing something else. He was buying land, quietly, steadily, ranch by ranch, county by county, state by state. The cable cowboy was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming the largest private landowner in America, and the story of how he got there and why is the story we have been building toward since the very beginning. Chapter 5: A Billionaire Built on Systems. To understand John Malone, you have to understand a number that most people find counterintuitive. 0, as in zero taxes. Not tax evasion, not tax fraud, not anything illegal, but a systematic, deeply sophisticated approach to structuring a business in a way that minimizes taxable income to the point where it becomes, year after year, almost nothing. Malone once told a journalist that his goal, in managing TCI's finances, was to pay as close to zero in taxes as legally possible. And for long stretches of his career, he came remarkably close to achieving it. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity, even if its execution was extraordinarily complex. You borrow money to acquire assets. The interest payments on that debt reduce your taxable income. At the same time, you depreciate those assets on paper, which further reduces your taxable income. And because the cash your business generates exceeds what you need to service the debt, you are effectively growing, building equity, accumulating value, while your paper profits remain near zero or below it. On the surface, this looks like a failing company, and critics, for years, argued that it was exactly that. They said TCI was a house of cards. They said the debt load was unsustainable. They said the whole structure would eventually collapse. It did not collapse. It grew into the largest cable company in America, and then it sold for $55 billion. TCI at its peak served more than 14 million cable subscribers, roughly 1 in 6 American households with a television at the time. Its debt load in the mid-1990s was estimated at more than $11 billion. The AT&T acquisition was valued at approximately $55 billion in stock, placing it among the 10 largest corporate transactions in American history up to that point. Through Liberty Media, Malone went on to hold significant stakes in companies operating across multiple continents, and a single conservation easement on 10,000 acres of mountain ranch land in Colorado can generate a tax deduction worth $5 million or more. Multiply that arithmetic across 2 million acres, and the numbers become something the ordinary imagination was not designed to process. The critics were measuring the wrong thing. They were looking at earnings. Malone was building equity. This distinction between what a company earns on paper and what it is actually worth is not unique to Malone, but the consistency and scale with which he applied it across more than 2 decades was genuinely unusual. He turned it into a philosophy, and that philosophy had a name. He called it building long-term value. What it meant, in practice, was this: do not optimize for today's income. Do not optimize for this quarter's earnings. Optimize for the asset base you will hold in 10 years, or 20 years, or 30 years. Think in generations, not in quarters. Use debt to accelerate the accumulation of assets. Use tax efficiency to preserve the capital generated by those assets. And never, if you can possibly avoid it, sell anything. That last point is crucial because selling triggers taxes. When you sell an appreciated asset, you owe capital gains taxes on the difference between what you paid and what you received. But if you never sell, you never pay those taxes. The appreciation accumulates, untaxed, inside the structure you have built. Malone also became a master of the corporate spin-off. Rather than selling divisions of his businesses, he would separate them into independent companies and distribute shares to existing shareholders. This allowed him to unlock value from assets without triggering the tax consequences of a sale. Liberty Media, the empire he built after TCI, became famous for this kind of structural creativity. It was, at various points, a holding company for interests in everything from satellite television to Formula One racing to major media conglomerates. The financial press struggled to describe what Liberty Media actually was, because it was not, in the conventional sense, a business. It was a structure, a framework for holding and managing assets in the most tax-efficient way possible over the longest possible time horizon. Sound familiar? Because this is also, essentially, what land does. Land does not generate quarterly earnings reports. It does not have a CEO who answers to analysts. It sits there, patient and quiet, and it appreciates. And if you are strategic about how you hold it, through conservation easements and trusts and carefully structured ownership arrangements, it can also generate significant tax benefits. Malone, the cable operator, and Malone, the land baron, were not two different people with two different philosophies. They were the same person, applying the same philosophy to two different asset classes. The cable systems were networks. Networks had value because they controlled the infrastructure through which information traveled. And whoever controlled that infrastructure collected a toll on everything that passed through it. Land is also a network of water rights and grazing rights and mineral rights and access rights. A network that controls, in ways that are invisible to most people, the conditions of life for everyone around it. When Malone sold TCI to AT&T in 1999, he did not retire. He did not slow down. He reorganized. He took the capital generated by the sale and the Liberty Media structure he had built, and he accelerated the other project he had been quietly running in parallel for years. He started buying land faster. Because the thing about Malone's financial philosophy is that it requires assets. Patient, long-duration assets that can be held for decades. Assets that generate reliable value without being liquidated. And there is no asset more patient or more durable or more capable of being held across generations than land. He had figured this out before most people were paying attention, and by the time they started paying attention, he had already accumulated something extraordinary. Chapter 6. When the Empire was sold. On the 9th of March, 1999, the boards of AT&T and Telecommunications, Inc. signed an agreement that would reshape the American telecommunications landscape for years to come. The price was approximately $55 billion. To put that number in context, it was, at the time, one of the largest acquisitions in American corporate history. It was larger than the gross domestic product of most countries on Earth. It was a number so large that even the financial press, accustomed to writing about large numbers, struggled to convey what it actually meant. For John Malone, it meant something specific. It meant that the first chapter of his professional life was over, and the second chapter, the quieter chapter, the one that would eventually make him more powerful in some ways than the first, could begin in earnest. To understand what happened in the years surrounding that sale, you have to understand what Malone had built before it. TCI was the headline. It was the company everyone knew about. But while Malone was running TCI, he was also, through the Liberty structure and various other arrangements, building a portfolio of interests in content companies, technology ventures, and international cable operations that existed separately from TCI itself. When AT&T bought TCI, it bought the cable systems. It did not buy everything. What it did not buy was John Malone's financial mind, his ability to structure transactions, His patient, long-horizon approach to asset accumulation, his network of relationships in the media and finance world that had been built over 3 decades of being one of the most important operators in American cable. All of that remained with Malone, and he put it to work immediately. Liberty Media, the vehicle through which Malone had held various non-TCI interests, became the center of a new Liberty empire. Over the following 2 decades, it would acquire, spin off, restructure, and reorganize dozens of different assets in a way that even sophisticated financial analysts found difficult to follow. Malone seemed at times to regard the confusion as a feature rather than a bug. A structure that is difficult to analyze is a structure that is difficult to attack. But here is what was happening underneath all the financial complexity. While the Liberty Media maneuvers occupied the attention of analysts and journalists and industry watchers, Malone was simultaneously engaged in a completely separate project that attracted almost no attention at all. He was building one of the largest private land empires in American history. It did not happen overnight. It happened the way most of Malone's projects happened, methodically, quietly, one acquisition at a time, over many years. Ranch here, timber parcel there, a conservation easement in one state, a grazing operation in another. The Bell Ranch in northeastern New Mexico was one of the signature acquisitions. It is a historic property, one of the great ranches of the American Southwest, spanning more than 250,000 acres of high plains and canyon country. The Bell Ranch had been famous in the cattle industry for over a century before Malone acquired it. It was the kind of property that land people, the ranchers and historians and conservationists who think seriously about the American West, recognized immediately as a landmark. Malone added it to a portfolio that already included ranches in Colorado and Wyoming, timberlands in Maine, equestrian properties in Florida, and holdings in other states. And then he kept adding. By 2011, the year that various land industry publications began tracking the numbers carefully enough to notice, Malone had surpassed Ted Turner to become the largest private landowner in the United States. His holdings were estimated at approximately 2.2 million acres. 2.2 million acres. The state of Delaware is approximately 1.3 million acres. The state of Rhode Island is approximately 800,000 acres. Together, they add up to roughly what one man in Colorado had quietly assembled while building a media empire. It is a number that does not quite make sense the first time you hear it, because the mental image most people carry of what a wealthy person owns does not scale to that magnitude. A mansion, yes. A compound, perhaps. A few thousand acres of beautiful countryside. But 2 million acres defies the ordinary imagination. It requires a different kind of thinking to grasp. Not the thinking of personal consumption, of wanting to own something beautiful or impressive, but the thinking of a system builder, the thinking of someone who sees land not as a place to live, but as an asset class. A portfolio, a structure with financial and political and ecological dimensions that extend far beyond any individual parcel. The AT&T sale did not create Malone the land baron. That project was already well underway by the time the deal closed. But the enormous capital it generated and the freedom it gave Malone from the operational demands of running TC1 allowed that project to accelerate in ways it could not have otherwise. The cable cowboy had gotten his money out. Now came the land. And the land, once you understand the scale of it, changes the story entirely. Chapter 7. The Quiet Buying Spree. It begins, as most quiet things do, before anyone is looking. In the 1980s, while John Malone was locked in the daily battles of building TC1 into a cable giant, he began acquiring ranch land in Colorado. The purchases were modest by the scale of what would come later. A few thousand acres here, a grazing operation there, properties close enough to Denver that a man running a major corporation could actually use them, ride across them, walk the fence lines on a weekend morning, and feel, for a few hours, something different from the pressured world of leveraged buyouts and franchise negotiations. But there was more to it than recreation. Malone had grown up in Connecticut. He had been educated in the densely built intellectual corridors of Yale and Johns Hopkins and Bell Labs. His professional life had been spent in offices and boardrooms and courtrooms, in the abstract world of contracts and capital structures and spectrum rights. And yet something about the West pulled at him. Something about the ranching life, or at least the idea of it, resonated with the part of him that the cable cowboy nickname had always been gesturing toward. His wife, Leslie, shared the feeling, and in many accounts she deepened it. She became seriously involved in equestrian pursuits, and the Florida properties that Malone acquired in later years were in significant part organized around her passion for horses. The buying did not stop at the American border. Malone also acquired estate land in Ireland, a detail that tends to surface briefly in profiles of him and then disappear. But that carries a resonance worth sitting with. A cable billionaire from Connecticut, assembling landed estates in the country that the English aristocracy once used as the laboratory for everything the American founders claimed to be rejecting. The land for the Malones was not purely a financial instrument. It was also genuinely a way of life. But the financial dimension was always present. It is simply not possible to understand why one man owns 2.2 million acres by focusing only on lifestyle. Lifestyle explains a ranch. It does not explain an empire. The tax incentives for large-scale land ownership in the United States are substantial and worth understanding. Conservation easements, in particular, are a mechanism through which landowners can receive significant tax deductions by agreeing to restrict the development potential of their property. If you own a ranch and you agree, through a legally binding easement, that the land will never be subdivided or developed, you can deduct from your taxable income a value based on the difference between what the land would be worth with development rights and what it is worth without them. On large parcels of land in desirable areas, that difference can be enormous, and the deduction can be spread across multiple years, providing a stream of tax benefits that flows for a long time after the easement is signed. Malone has placed conservation easements on significant portions of his land holdings. He has been publicly identified with conservation causes, and the organization Land Trust Alliance has recognized him for his contributions to the conservation easement model. But critics, including some within the conservation community itself, have raised questions about who benefits most from this system. The land is protected from development, which is genuinely good for wildlife and ecosystems. But the tax benefits flow to the landowner, not to the public. And the public has no say in how the land is managed within the terms of the easement. The land is private. The access is private. The decisions about water use and grazing and hunting and logging are private. The public gets the conservation. The owner gets the deduction. Whether that is a fair trade is a question that different people answer differently. But the buying continued regardless of the debate. Through the 1990s and 2000s and into the 2010s, Malone accumulated properties in Maine, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Colorado. The Maine holdings alone, primarily timberland, are estimated at roughly 1 million acres, representing more than 5% of the entire state's land area. Think about that for a moment. More than 1 in every 20 acres in Maine, a state with a long and complex history of timber industry ownership, belongs to a cable television billionaire from Colorado. The Wyoming and Colorado ranches include some of the most scenically dramatic landscapes in the American West. High mountain terrain, river corridors, wildlife habitat that connects to larger ecosystems of ecological significance. The Silver Spur Ranches, which is the umbrella name under which many of Malone's Western holdings are organized, operate as a genuine ranching enterprise. Cattle are raised, land is managed. The operation is not a theme park or a conservation museum. It is a working ranch at a scale that dwarfs most of what still exists in American agriculture. Malone's main timberland holdings alone are estimated at between 900,000 and 1 million acres, an area larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. The Bell Ranch in New Mexico covers approximately 255,000 acres of high plains and canyon country. In 2011, when Malone surpassed Ted Turner to become the largest private landowner in the United States, his total holdings were estimated at 2.2 million acres. The country of Luxembourg covers approximately 630,000 acres. Malone owns more than 3 Luxembourgs. He has never held elected office. He has never commanded an army. He has never signed a treaty. He simply bought the land, parcel by parcel, until the total became a number that does not fit inside the ordinary vocabulary of private ownership. And through all of it, the buying continued. Quietly. Year after year, property after property. By the time most people became aware that John Malone was the largest private landowner in the United States, the fact had already been true for years. The accumulation had happened in plain sight, in public land records and property tax rolls and conservation easement filings, but below the threshold of general attention. That is the nature of quiet power. It does not announce itself. It simply accumulates, and by the time you notice it, it has already become very large. Chapter 8. The American West. There is a version of the American West that exists in the imagination of people who have never been there. It is the West of the movies, the West of Monument Valley silhouettes and lone riders against burning sunsets, the West of the cattle drive and the one-street town and the judge who is also the sheriff, who is also the only man with a gun for 50 miles. The West of freedom, the West of space, the West of the idea that if you ride far enough, you will eventually reach somewhere that no system, no institution, no authority of any kind has yet reached ahead of you. This West does not exist. It probably never fully existed, even in the era that gave rise to the myth. But the myth itself is one of the most powerful forces in American culture. It has shaped politics, shaped policy, shaped the way Americans understand property rights and government, and the relationship between individuals and the land they live on. It has shaped, in particular, the way the American West has been governed and mismanaged and fought over for 150 years. The real history of the American West is a history of competing claims on a landscape that could not accommodate all of them simultaneously. The indigenous peoples who had lived on that land for thousands of years before European contact understood it through systems of relationship and stewardship that were not organized around individual ownership. Land, in most Native American traditions, was not something you could own the way you owned a horse or a blanket. You could belong to it. You could be responsible for it. But the idea that a single person could draw a line around a piece of the earth and say, "This is mine and no one else may enter," was, to most native cultures, a kind of category error. The European settlers did not see it that way. They brought with them a legal and philosophical tradition that treated individual ownership of land as a fundamental right. The land was there to be claimed, worked, and held, and so they claimed it. The fact that it was already occupied was a contradiction the new republic resolved not through philosophy but through force. The consequences of that resolution have never been fully settled. After the displacement of native peoples, the mythology shifted, but the underlying pattern did not. The West became the story of the independent rancher and the homesteader carving out a life from hard ground. Some of that was real. But the West was also, from the very beginning of the American period, a place where concentrated ownership was the norm. The cattle barons of the 1870s and 1880s ran herds across ranges they did not legally own, drove out smaller operators, and controlled vast landscapes through economic dominance rather than deeds. This is the history that the landscape of the American West actually contains, underneath the mythology. And it is the history that the modern land baron steps into when he buys his first ranch, whether he knows it or not, whether he intends to or not, because the land does not care about intentions. The land simply records who holds the deed. And the deed, in the 21st century, increasingly belongs to people who built their fortunes not from the land itself, but from the abstract systems of capital that now sit above the land and determine its fate. The frontier mythology says that land belongs to the person willing to work it, to claim it, to defend it. The reality of the modern West says something different. It says that land belongs to the person with the best tax lawyer and the most patient long-term investment horizon. These are not the same thing, and the distance between them is the distance between the myth of the West and the truth of it. A distance that, as you stand in the middle of a 250,000-acre ranch owned by a cable television billionaire, feels very large indeed. Chapter 9. The Ranch Empire. If you drive south from Denver on Interstate 25, past the city's southern suburbs and into the broad grasslands of the Front Range, you eventually reach a stretch of country where the mountains pull back from the road and the plains open up into something vast and unhurried. The light changes here. The sky gets bigger. The noise of the city fades behind you, and in its place comes a silence that is not quite silence, because the wind is always moving across the grass, and the hawks are always riding the thermals above the ridgelines, and somewhere beyond the fence line there are cattle grazing in a way that looks, from the road, as if time has stopped. This is the country John Malone bought. Not this exact stretch of road, but country like it. Country where the scale of the landscape resets your sense of proportion, where you drive for an hour and the property markers have not changed, where the feeling of space is so complete that it begins to feel less like geography and more like a statement. There is a particular culture that has grown up around the large ranch in the American West. It is distinct from the culture of farming, which is tied to seasons and crops and the anxiety of yield. Ranch culture is tied instead to something slower, to the long view, to the management of land across decades rather than growing seasons, to the idea that a well-run ranch is not optimized for any single year, but for the health of the landscape over a generation. Malone's ranching operations, organized under the Silver Spur Ranch's banner, are by most accounts run with exactly that philosophy. Professional ranch managers, working cattle operations, careful attention to land stewardship. The people who work on these properties are not decorative cowboys. They are professionals managing complex ecosystems at enormous scale. The Bell Ranch in New Mexico is perhaps the most historically significant of Malone's holdings. It was established in the 19th century and has operated continuously as a cattle ranch for well over 100 years. It sits in the Canadian River Valley of northeastern New Mexico, a landscape of broken mesas and short-grass prairie that has barely changed in appearance since the first European settlers pushed into it in the 1800s. When Malone acquired the Bell Ranch, he acquired not just the land, but the history embedded in it. The generations of ranching families, the cattle genetics developed over a century of careful breeding, the water rights, the infrastructure, the ecological knowledge accumulated across more than 100 years of working the same ground. That kind of continuity is not easy to put a dollar value on. But it is real, and it is part of what distinguishes the serious large ranch from the vanity purchase, the trophy property bought by a wealthy person who wants to feel connected to the West without being willing to do the work that connection actually requires. By most accounts, Malone did the work. Or at least, he hired the people who did. And he allowed them to do it without interference, which in ranch management terms is itself a form of stewardship. But the scale of what he assembled goes beyond any single property. The Silver Spur holdings in Colorado and Wyoming together span country that includes high mountain meadows, riparian corridors along major river systems, and transitional zones between mountain and plains ecosystems. These are not isolated parcels, they are connected landscapes, managed as a unit, in a way that has implications for wildlife, water, and the ecological health of entire regions. The Greenland Ranch in Colorado, for instance, sits directly in one of the most significant wildlife migration corridors in the southern Rocky Mountain region. Animals moving between summer range in the mountains and winter range on the plains cross through properties like this one. If those properties are developed, the corridor closes. The migration stops. The populations decline. If they are held as working ranches with conservation easements in place, the corridor stays open. The migration continues. The ecosystem functions as it is supposed to function. This is the strongest argument in favor of what Malone and ranchers like him have done. Conservation at scale requires land at scale. You cannot protect a migration corridor with 1,000 individual small parcels managed by 1,000 different owners with 1,000 different priorities. You need someone who controls enough of the landscape to make decisions that are ecologically coherent. And John Malone controls a lot of landscape. The question is whether the ecological benefit justifies the concentration, whether the conservation outcomes that come with this kind of ownership are worth the democratic costs of having so much land in so few hands. That question does not have an easy answer, but the land does not wait for easy answers. The cattle graze. The hawks ride the thermals. The wind moves across the grass. And the fence lines keep going farther than you expect. Chapter 10. The Conservation Question. In the spring of 2004, a conservation organization called the Nature Conservancy published a report that changed the way many people in the environmental world thought about large private landowners. The report argued, with considerable supporting data, that the greatest threat to biodiversity and open land in the American West was not industrial pollution or climate change or overgrazing, though all of those were real concerns. The greatest threat was development. The subdivision of large ranches into housing developments, vacation properties, and exurban sprawl. The fragmentation of continuous landscapes into disconnected parcels too small to support the ecosystems that had evolved within them. And the report made a further argument that was, at the time, genuinely controversial within the conservation community. It argued that the large private landowner, the rancher, who held tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres as a single unit, was often a more effective conservation partner than any public agency or nonprofit organization. Because the large private owner had the scale, the resources, and the long-term commitment to manage land in ways that public agencies, constrained by politics and budget cycles and competing mandates, often could not. This argument was music to the ears of John Malone. And, to be fair to the argument, it is not without merit. Conservation easements, the legal mechanism through which landowners agree to restrict development on their properties in exchange for tax benefits, have genuinely protected millions of acres of American land that would otherwise have been subdivided and built upon. The land trust movement, which facilitates these easements and monitors compliance with them, has by most assessments been an effective force for conservation in the United States. Malone has been one of the most significant participants in this system. His land holdings are associated with conservation easements that protect large areas from development in perpetuity. The ecological value of those easements is real. The wildlife corridors they preserve are real. The water quality benefits of keeping ranch land as ranch land, rather than turning it into housing developments, are real. But the conservation framing also raises questions it tends not to answer. The first question is about access. When a large private landowner places a conservation easement on their land, the public benefit is primarily ecological. The land stays open, the wildlife stays, the water stays clean, but the public cannot walk on it. The public cannot hunt or fish or ride or camp on it without the landowner's permission. It remains, in every meaningful sense, private. Compare this to the alternative. If that same land were purchased by a public agency, a national forest or a state park or a wildlife refuge, it would also be protected from development, but it would be accessible. Any citizen could enter it. Any child could walk through it. The conservation value would be identical, but the democratic dimension would be completely different. The second question is about who decides. A conservation easement restricts development, but within the terms of the easement, the landowner retains management authority. They decide how many cattle graze and where. They decide whether to allow hunting and who gets access. They decide how the water is used within the bounds of their water rights. They decide whether to log the timber and when. The public has no voice in any of these decisions. The easement guarantees the land will not be subdivided. It does not guarantee it will be managed well. The third question is about the tax structure itself. The conservation easement deduction is, by design, available only to people who own large amounts of land in places where development pressure is high, which is to say, it is a tax benefit available almost exclusively to the wealthy. The federal government is effectively subsidizing the conservation choices of billionaires by reducing their tax bills, while ordinary taxpayers, who might prefer that the same land be managed as a public park, have no say in how their subsidy is being spent. Critics within the conservation world have called this a privatization of public conservation. The government is paying for outcomes it has no control over, on land it does not own, at the direction of individuals whose interests do not always align with the public interest. Defenders of the system respond that the alternative is worse. Without the tax incentives, the argument goes, many large ranches would be sold to developers. The easement system creates a financial incentive that makes conservation economically rational for landowners who might otherwise sell. The government is not buying conservation. It is making conservation the path of least financial resistance. Both of these arguments contain truth. Neither of them is complete. And John Malone exists at the center of this unresolved debate, as he has for decades, without appearing to feel the need to resolve it publicly. He owns the land. He has placed easements on portions of it. He has been recognized for his conservation contributions by organizations that work in this space. Whether that makes him a conservationist or a sophisticated tax planner, or both simultaneously, is a question that depends on who you ask and what weight you assign to intentions versus outcomes. The land, as always, offers no opinion. It simply waits to see what is decided about it, which is, in a way, the most important thing about land. It outlasts the debate. Chapter 11. Who Owns the Wilderness? John Malone is not alone. This is worth repeating, because the story of any individual billionaire, no matter how large his land holdings, can create the impression that the phenomenon it represents is unusual, exceptional, a single outlier at the far edge of the distribution. It is not. Malone is the most prominent figure in a pattern that involves dozens of extraordinarily wealthy individuals, spread across multiple industries and multiple decades, all engaged in the same basic project of converting liquid financial wealth into permanent physical land. Ted Turner started earlier than almost anyone else in the modern era. His first major ranch acquisition came in the 1970s, before the conservation easement system had been widely developed, before the tax advantages of large-scale land holding had been fully mapped by the financial planning industry, before the idea of the billionaire rancher had become common enough to have a name. Turner simply loved the land. He loved bison. He loved the idea of restoring the Great Plains to something approaching its pre-settlement ecological character. Whether or not you find that vision compelling, the scale of what he built is striking. At his peak, Turner held close to 2 million acres spread across Montana, New Mexico, Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, and other states. He operated the largest bison herd in the world. He built a restaurant chain, Ted's Montana Grill, specifically to create a commercial market for bison meat that would make the ecological restoration economically viable. Turner's model was, in many respects, the template that later billionaire landowners would follow, consciously or not. Buy land at scale, hold it permanently, use it for a purpose that combines ecological stewardship with some form of economic activity that justifies the holding. Frame the ownership in conservation terms. String. The Emerson family represents yet another model. Their wealth came from timber, specifically from Sierra Pacific Industries, the California-based timber company that Red Emerson built from a small sawmill operation in the 1950s into the largest private timber company in the United States. The Emerson family's holdings are now estimated at more than 2 million acres, concentrated in the Sierra Nevada and the forests of Northern California and Washington state. In 2021, that accumulation crossed a threshold. Sierra Pacific Industries surpassed John Malone to become the largest private landowner in the United States. The cable cowboy, who had held the title since 2011, was displaced not by a rancher or a media mogul, but by a timber operation. It is a detail that rarely makes headlines, but it clarifies something important about the nature of the competition. The race to own the most American land is not over. It does not have a permanent winner. It simply continues, quietly, in deed records and county assessor filings, while most of the country looks elsewhere. The timber model is different from the ranch model in important ways. Timber is actively harvested. The land generates revenue through logging operations in a way that cattle ranching, at the scale most billionaire ranchers operate, typically does not. But the underlying logic of large-scale, permanent land holding is the same. The Emerson family does not buy timberland to sell it. They buy it to hold it, manage it, harvest from it, and hold it again. The pattern repeats across dozens of other names that appear on the lists of the largest private landowners, many of which the general public would not recognize. The Briscoe family in Texas, the Irving family in Maine, the Reed family in California, institutional investors managing timber and farmland portfolios on behalf of pension funds and endowments. The boundaries between individual billionaire landowners and institutional landowners are increasingly blurred. The land does not distinguish between them. The Bell Ranch alone covers 255,000 acres, more than the entire land area of the city of Los Angeles and its surrounding metro region combined. Ted Turner's peak holdings of close to 2 million acres would make him the effective ruler of a territory larger than the country of Lebanon. Stan Kroenke's Wagoner Ranch in Texas generates revenues from oil wells that number in the thousands, cattle operations that run tens of thousands of head, and farmland that produces crops across acreage larger than many American counties. The Emerson family's Sierra Pacific Industries employs more than 2,000 people across its timber operations and controls more forest land than the entire national forest system of 15 states combined. The top 10 private landowners in the United States together hold more than 30 million acres, an area larger than the entire state of Mississippi. What unites these people is not a shared political philosophy or a shared vision of what land is for. Turner is a vocal environmentalist. Kroenke is not known for environmental advocacy. The Emersons are in the business of cutting trees. Malone is somewhere between conservationist and financial strategist, depending on who you ask. What unites them is something simpler and more fundamental. They all decided, at the moment when they had the financial capacity to decide anything they wanted, that what they wanted was land, and they decided it with enough conviction to act on it at a scale that changed the map. Why? Some of it is taxes, some of it is conservation, some of it is the deep human desire to own something permanent in a world where most things are temporary. Some of it is the frontier mythology, the pull of the cowboy fantasy that Americans have been unable to fully outgrow since Frederick Jackson Turner announced the frontier's closing in 1890. Some of it may be something older and harder to name. The instinct that says, if you can own the land, you control what happens on it. And if you control what happens on it, you hold something that no market crash, no regulation, no political shift can easily take away. Land is the oldest argument for security in human history, and these are people who have thought very carefully about security. Chapter 12. The Invisible Power of Land. There is a word that does not appear very often in conversations about large private landowners in America: water. It should appear more often. Because when you own 2 million acres spread across the American West, you do not just own the soil and the grass and the timber. You own, or control, or have rights adjacent to, an enormous quantity of the most contested resource in the driest region of the United States. Water in the American West is not like water in the East. In the East, water law is based on the principle that anyone whose land borders a stream has a right to use a reasonable amount of it. In the West, water law is based on an entirely different principle, the doctrine of prior appropriation, which says that the right to use water belongs to whoever claimed it first, regardless of where their land sits in relation to the stream. First in time, first in right. This doctrine made a certain kind of sense in the 19th century when the West was being settled rapidly and someone needed to allocate a finite resource among competing claimants. But its long-term consequence is a water rights system in which the most valuable rights belong to the people who arrived earliest, or who acquired the holdings of the people who arrived earliest, which is to say, in the 21st century, the people who bought the historic ranches. John Malone, when he acquired the Bell Ranch and the Silver Spur properties and the other historic holdings in his portfolio, acquired not just land, but water rights that in some cases date back more than a century. In the arid West, where the Colorado River is already over-allocated and aquifer levels in multiple states have been declining for decades, those water rights may ultimately be worth more than the land itself. This is not a speculative concern. Water markets in the American West are already active. Water rights are already being bought and sold as investment assets by hedge funds and institutional investors who have no interest in the land itself, only in the water attached to it. The price of water rights in some western states has appreciated faster than the price of the land over the past 2 decades. When a billionaire acquires a historic ranch, they are acquiring simultaneously a position in the most strategic natural resource competition of the 21st century. Whether they understand it in those terms, or whether they are simply ranchers who happen to also hold water rights, the effect on the regional water economy is the same. The water rights concentrate along with the land. And water is not an abstraction the way that cable television contracts are abstractions. When the water that flows through a property is controlled by a private owner, the communities downstream, the farms, the towns, the cities, that depend on that same watershed are dependent on decisions made by someone who did not elect to be their water manager and whom they have no mechanism to hold accountable. But land's invisible power extends even beyond water. When a large private landowner places their property under a conservation easement, they gain influence over the development trajectory of an entire region. If you own the largest parcel in a county, and that parcel cannot be developed, the pattern of development in the surrounding area is shaped by your ownership. Roads get built around you. Towns grow in different directions because of you. The economic geography of the region is reorganized around the fact of your land. This is power. Real, consequential, long-duration power. Exercised not through votes or appointments or press releases, but through the quiet, persistent fact of the deed. In Colorado, Malone's opposition to a major residential development proposed near one of his properties contributed to the failure of that project. The details of how that opposition was expressed are not fully public, but the outcome was that a development that would have brought thousands of new residents to a stretch of the Front Range did not happen. The landscape stayed open. Whether you regard that as a victory for conservation or an exercise of private veto power over public land, use decisions depends entirely on your point of view. Both descriptions are accurate, and neither of them is the whole story. The Colorado River, which originates in Rocky Mountain snowpack that falls partly on land owned by people like Malone and Cronka, supplies water to approximately 40 million people across 7 states and parts of Mexico. The total amount of water flowing through the river system in an average year has been declining for decades. Groundwater aquifers beneath the Great Plains, the Ogallala aquifer in particular, are being drawn down faster than they are recharged, and agricultural operations on land owned by large landowners represent a significant share of that draw. The largest private landowners in the United States collectively control land that encompasses the headwaters of dozens of major river systems. In New Mexico alone, the state where the Bell Ranch sits, water rights disputes between large private landowners, indigenous communities, and municipal water authorities have been active in the courts for more than 50 years. What happens on private land does not stay on private land. That is the fundamental truth that the scale of modern land concentration forces us to confront. The fence line marks the boundary of private property, but the water does not stop at the fence. The wildlife does not stop at the fence. The downstream consequences of upstream decisions do not stop at the fence. And in a country that is still working out what it means for so much land to belong to so few people, those consequences are becoming harder to ignore. The land is quiet, but what it contains is not. Chapter 13: The Politics of Open Space. In the summer of 2016, a coalition of ranchers, environmental groups, and local government officials in a county on Colorado's Front Range found themselves in an unusual alliance. They were fighting a proposed development, a large residential project that would have placed thousands of new homes on a stretch of open grassland that served as a buffer between the urban corridor along Interstate 25 and the ranch country to the east and south. The development had been in the planning stages for years. It had zoning approvals pending. It had financing lined up. It had, on paper, everything it needed to proceed. And then it did not proceed. The precise reasons are complex, and the full story involves layers of local politics, environmental review, and private negotiation that have never been made entirely public. But among the factors cited by people familiar with the situation was the opposition of a large neighboring landowner whose property sat directly adjacent to the proposed development footprint. That landowner's opposition did not take the form of a public campaign. It did not involve press releases or protest marches or testimony at county commission hearings, at least not primarily. It took the form that power often takes when it is large and patient and does not need to make noise to be effective. It simply made the project more difficult, more contested, more expensive to pursue, and eventually the project stopped. This is not presented here as a story of corruption or illegality. There is no evidence of either. It is presented as a story about the nature of political gravity, about the way that very large landowners exert influence on the decisions that shape the places they own, not necessarily through formal political participation, but through the sheer weight of their presence in the landscape. When you own more land in a county than the county has residents, you are not a stakeholder in local politics. You are a structural feature of it. Your interests are built into the geography, and the geography shapes everything. This dynamic plays out across the rural West in ways that are rarely examined with the attention they deserve. County governments in the American West are, in many cases, the most consequential local political institutions that most Americans never think about. They control zoning, they issue permits, they manage water districts, they make decisions about roads and easements and access rights that determine the economic fate of the land within their boundaries. And in counties where a single landowner controls a significant percentage of the taxable land, the relationship between that landowner and the county government is never quite a relationship between equals. The tax revenues that large ranches generate for rural counties are, in many cases, modest relative to the land's assessed value, because agricultural land is typically taxed at a fraction of its market value under state tax preference laws designed to support working farms and ranches. So the landowner is not necessarily the county's largest taxpayer, but they are often the county's most consequential constituent because the land use decisions they make, or decline to make, shape the economic future of the entire county. If a large ranch owner decides to sell to a developer, the county changes overnight. New residents arrive. New demands are placed on roads and schools and water systems. The rural character of the place shifts, sometimes irreversibly. County commissioners who resisted development on a large ranch were, in effect, relying on the private decisions of a private owner to maintain the open space that their constituents valued. That is a strange kind of governance, one that is almost entirely invisible unless you know to look for it. The politics of open space in the American West is not primarily conducted in election campaigns or legislative chambers. It is conducted in land transactions, easement negotiations, and the quiet accumulation of acreage by people who have decided that the landscape is worth controlling. And that political process produces outcomes, just like any other. The question is who those outcomes serve, and who was never asked. Chapter 14, When Land Never Returns. There is a word that estate planners use when they talk about land held by wealthy families across generations: dynasty. It is another word, like aristocracy, that Americans are uncomfortable with. It implies permanence. It implies inheritance. It implies a system in which the circumstances of your birth determine the resources available to you in ways that effort and talent and ambition cannot fully overcome. But dynasty is exactly the right word for what happens when large amounts of land are placed into the legal structures designed to hold them across generations. Trusts, limited liability companies, family limited partnerships, conservation easements that run not for a decade or a generation, but in perpetuity, which is to say forever, which is to say that the restriction placed on the land by its current owner will still be in effect when no one alive today is alive to remember why it was placed there. These structures are legal, they are widely used, they are, in many cases, explicitly encouraged by the tax code. But their cumulative effect, when applied to very large amounts of land, is to remove that land from the market permanently. Land that cannot be sold cannot be subdivided. Land that cannot be subdivided cannot be developed. Land that cannot be developed stays exactly as it is, managed according to the philosophy of whoever holds the deed, for as long as the legal structure that holds it remains intact. In theory, trusts can be broken. Conservation easements can, under extraordinary circumstances, be modified. Legal structures can be challenged. But in practice, land held in perpetuity tends to stay held. The legal costs of challenging a well-constructed land trust are prohibitive for most claimants. The political will to force the redistribution of private land in the United States is, at present, essentially non-existent, which means that the land being accumulated by the current generation of billionaire landowners may, in a very meaningful sense, be leaving the market permanently. It will not be available for the next generation of ordinary buyers. It will not be subdivided into smaller parcels that working families could afford. It will not become the substrate for new communities or new agricultural enterprises or new forms of land use that have not yet been imagined. It will stay where it is. The concentration will compound. And the question this raises is not simply about fairness, though it is about that too. It is about what kind of country the United States becomes when its landscape is locked into the private hands of a small number of families for perpetuity. The Homestead Act of 1862 was one of the most ambitious experiments in democratic land distribution in human history. It offered 160 acres of public land to any citizen who would settle it and farm it for 5 years. Over the following decades, more than 1.6 million homestead claims were filed. The act distributed more than 270 million acres of public land to private individuals, creating the class of small family farmers and ranchers that became the backbone of rural American culture for a century. That experiment is over. The public land available for homesteading is gone. The mechanism for distributing land to ordinary people no longer exists in any meaningful form. What exists instead is a market in which land prices in the most desirable parts of the country have risen to levels that place even modest rural properties beyond the reach of most Americans. In this environment, every acre that moves into a perpetual trust is an acre that will never move again. It is removed from the cycle of ownership and transfer and reuse that, in a healthy land market, creates the possibility of access for people who were not born holding the deed. The great irony is that many of the legal structures being used to lock land into dynastic ownership were designed with benevolent intentions. The conservation easement was designed to protect land from development. The family limited partnership was designed to allow small businesses to pass between generations without being destroyed by estate taxes. The perpetual trust was designed to ensure that the wishes of a careful steward would outlast their lifetime. But at sufficient scale, these benevolent instruments become something else. They become the architecture of permanent concentration. The numbers clarify the weight of what is at stake. More than 50 million acres of American land are currently protected by conservation easements, an area roughly the size of the state of Kansas, all of it removed from development in perpetuity. The Internal Revenue Service estimated in a recent study that conservation easement deductions cost the federal treasury more than $1 billion per year in foregone tax revenue. Land held in family trusts and limited liability structures by the wealthiest 1% of American landowners represents a market value estimated in the trillions of dollars. The Homestead Act distributed 270 million acres to more than 1.6 million claimants over nearly a century of operation. The top 100 private landowners today hold more than 40 million of those acres in forms that will not be redistributed through any mechanism currently available to the public. And behind all of it is a simple economic reality. Land in the United States has been appreciating in value faster than inflation for most of the past 50 years. In many parts of the country, particularly in the American West, it has been appreciating faster than wages, which means that every year that passes without a redistribution mechanism, the gap between those who hold land and those who do not grows wider. The frontier closed in 1890. But the consequences of that closing are still accumulating, quietly, parcel by parcel, trust by trust, the way most truly consequential things accumulate, without anyone announcing that it is happening. Chapter 15. The Myth of the Frontier. In 1890, a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner stood before the American Historical Association in Chicago and delivered a paper that would become one of the most debated and most influential arguments in the history of American intellectual life. He called it The Significance of the Frontier in American History. His central claim was simple and at the time alarming. The frontier was closed. For 3 centuries, Turner argued, the existence of free land at the western edge of settlement had been the defining fact of American democracy. It had provided a safety valve for economic discontent. It had nurtured the individualism, the self-reliance, the practical ingenuity that Americans thought of as their national character. It had made possible the democratic experiment because democracy functions differently in a society where land is available to anyone willing to claim it than it does in a society where land is already owned. And now that land was gone. The Census Bureau had declared in 1890 that the frontier line, the boundary between settled and unsettled territory, no longer existed as a continuous feature of the American landscape. The country was full. The free land was gone. The safety valve had closed. Turner did not say what would happen next. he asked the question, what does American democracy look like without the frontier that made it possible? That question has been contested ever since. Historians have argued about whether Turner's frontier thesis was accurate, whether the frontier was ever truly as he described it, whether the democratic values he attributed to it were real or mythological, whether the native peoples who were displaced to create it should be counted in any honest reckoning of its costs. All of those arguments are legitimate. All of them matter. But Turner's underlying question remains unanswered. And in the 21st century, it has taken on a new and stranger dimension. Because the frontier did not just close, it was bought. The land that was declared unavailable for settlement in 1890 did not stay in public hands. Much of it was privatized, parceled, sold, and resold across the following century and a quarter until it ended up, in many cases, in exactly the kind of concentrated ownership that the frontier myth had promised would never happen in America. The myth said, "This country is different. Here, the land belongs to everyone, or at least to anyone willing to work for it." The old-world hierarchies of inherited land and entrenched aristocracy have no place in a country built on the principle that any man can start over anywhere. The reality, in the 21st century, says something more complicated. The reality says that the land belongs to whoever can afford to buy it, and the people who can afford to buy it at the scale that shapes landscapes and watersheds and regional economies are an extraordinarily small group. They are not aristocrats in the European sense. They do not hold titles. Their ownership is not legally entrenched in the way that feudal land tenure was entrenched. Their land can, in theory, be sold or taxed or regulated, but the theory and the practice are very different things. In practice, the land is not being sold, it is being held. The tax environment rewards exactly this. The easement deduction, the agricultural tax preference, the stepped-up basis rule that eliminates capital gains taxes on inherited property. These are not accidents. They are choices made by a political system that reflects, in part, the interests of the people who already own the most land. And the mythology of the frontier makes it difficult to see any of this clearly, because the myth says that land ownership is democratic, that the accumulation of land through hard work and careful management is the most American thing imaginable. It makes 2 million acres in a single private hand seem like a natural extension of the frontier tradition rather than a departure from it. Frederick Jackson Turner asked what American democracy would look like without the frontier. 135 years later, we may be living in the early stages of the answer. And the answer involves John Malone and Ted Turner and Stan Kroenke and the Emerson family, and dozens of other names that most Americans do not know, controlling landscapes that most Americans will never walk across. Buying the country that the frontier left behind. Chapter 16. The New Land Barons. Return for a moment to the map. The one that most Americans have never seen. The one that does not hang in government buildings or appear on the front pages of newspapers. The one that shows, with quiet precision, who owns the American landscape. Look at it long enough and it begins to tell a story that is older than John Malone, older than the cable television industry, older than the financial structures and conservation easements and tax code provisions that have shaped the modern land market. It is the story of a tension that has run through American history since before the country existed. The tension between the promise of democratic ownership and the reality of concentrated power. Between the frontier mythology that says the land belongs to everyone and the economic logic that says the land belongs to whoever can pay for it. Between the conservationist impulse that says the land must be protected and the democratic impulse that says the land must be accessible. John Malone did not create this tension. He inherited it, as all Americans do, from a history that never resolved it. What he did was act within it, with extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary resources and a clarity of purpose that most people never bring to anything. He saw that land was the most durable asset class in the American economy. He saw that the legal and tax environment created powerful incentives for large-scale, long-term landholding. He saw that the mythology of the frontier made billionaire ranching culturally legible in a way that other forms of concentrated wealth were not. And he acted on what he saw. Whether that makes him a visionary or a symptom depends on the framework you bring to the question. The conservationist framework says he is a protector, that without owners like Malone, the landscapes he controls would have been fragmented and developed and degraded, that the wildlife corridors, the open rangelands, the intact watersheds he has helped preserve are more valuable than any use that a more distributed form of ownership might have made of the same land. That the alternative to the billionaire conservationist is not the small family rancher or the democratic homesteader. The alternative is the developer. The democratic framework says he is a concentration. That whatever ecological good his ownership produces, it comes at the cost of access, accountability, and the kind of diffuse democratic relationship with land that the frontier mythology promised. That the public benefits of conservation should not be used to justify private control at a scale that has no democratic analog in American history. That the question is not whether Malone is a good steward. The question is whether any individual should control that much landscape, regardless of how well they manage it. The economic framework says he is a rational actor, that he identified an asset class with favorable tax treatment, long-duration appreciation, and embedded optionality on water and mineral rights, and he accumulated it as efficiently as his capital allowed. That the system produced this outcome because the system was designed, through a long series of legislative and regulatory choices, to produce exactly this outcome. That if you want different results, you need different rules. All three frameworks contain truth. None of them is complete. And the man himself, quiet and private and deeply reluctant to be the subject of the story that his choices have created, does not appear to feel the need to resolve the question on our behalf. He owns the land. The land is managed. The cattle graze and the timber grows, and the hawks ride the thermals above the ridgelines in the late afternoon light. And somewhere beneath all of it, the water moves through the landscape in the direction that water always moves, which is downward and outward and into the lives of people who had no say in the decisions that shape its path. The American frontier was built on the idea that land could belong to anyone. The 21st century raises a different question, not who can claim the land, but who already has, and what it means that those two answers are not the same. The map is still there, patient and precise, recording what it has always recorded. Who holds the deed? Who draws the fence line? Who decides what happens to the ground beneath your feet? And who, in a country that still calls itself a democracy, never gets to vote on any of it?